There's something hauntingly beautiful about a kingdom in twilight. The way the moonlight spills over ancient stone, the quiet rustle of leaves, carrying secrets older than memory itself. Tonight, we step into the world of Thranduil, the last Elven King of the Woodland Realm, as he stands alone on his balcony, silver robes shimmering like starlight, his heart heavy with the weight of a fading legacy. Can you feel it? The air hums with unspoken sorrow, the echoes of a greatness that once was, now slipping through his fingers like mist. Wherever you're listening from, whether it's the hush of midnight or the golden glow of dusk, we'd love to know what time your own journey into this tale begins. Let us know in the comments below, and let's wander together into this story of longing, courage, and the last hope of an Elven King. The Woodland Realm was once a place of unmatched splendor, its halls alive with song, its forests pulsing with ancient magic. But now the shadows grow longer, the whispers of decay threading through the very roots of the trees. Thranduil, proud and solitary, feels the weight of every passing century. His kingdom, once a beacon of elven glory, now stands as a testament to time's relentless march. Yet tonight, beneath the cold glow of the moon, something stirs within him, a resolve as sharp as the blade at his side. He clenches his fist, the weight of his crown, no longer just a symbol of power, but a burden he refuses to bear without a fight. What drives a king to seek the wisdom of the gods? Thranduil's journey is not just one of restoration, but of reckoning. The Valor, those ancient and distant beings, hold secrets that could mend his realm, or unravel it entirely. But the path to their counsel is fraught with trials no elf, not even a king, can foresee. As we follow him into the depths of this tale, we'll uncover the price of hope, the cost of pride, and the fragile line between salvation and ruin. So settle in, dear listener, and let the whispers of the Woodland Realm carry you away. The story of Thranduil, the last of his kind, is about to begin. Thranduil's chambers echoed with the weight of his decision, the firelight casting long shadows across the walls as Gallion stood before him, his face etched with concern. The old advisor had served the king for centuries, but never had he seen such steel in Thranduil's gaze. The undying lands are not meant for our kind, Gallion murmured, his voice hesitant. The voyage alone could claim your life, and the Valor do not welcome those who seek them uninvited. But the king's jaw tightened, his fingers tracing the edge of his throne. Would you have me watch my kingdom fade into shadow? He countered, the words sharp as a blade. I will not stand idle while the woods wither and our people forget what it means to be elves. A hush fell between them, heavy as the twilight outside. Gallion bowed his head, recognizing the futility of further argument. Pride, that double-edged elven virtue, had sealed Thranduil's path. Yet even as the king turned to gather his provisions, a cloak woven with starlight, a dagger forged in the fires of elder days, the murmurs began. In the corridors of the palace, among the guards and scribes, questions slithered like mist. If our king abandons us, who will hold back the darkness? One whispered. Another replied, perhaps he seeks not salvation, but escape. The words stung, but Thranduil would not hear them. His resolve was a fortress, unshaken by doubt. The night before his departure, he walked the empty halls, trailing his fingers over carvings of forgotten battles and lost glories. The very stones seemed to sigh beneath his touch, as if mourning what was to come. Somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the sea, lay answers, or so he hoped. But the road to the undying lands was a labyrinth of trials, and not all who sought it returned. As the first light of dawn tinged the horizon, Thranduil mounted his elk, its antlers crowned with frost. He did not look back. The forest swallowed him whole, and with him went the last hope of the Woodland Realm, or so the whispers claimed. Deep in the heart of the palace, behind doors that had not opened in an age, lay the sacred archives, a vault of crumbling scrolls and whispered truths. Thranduil moved through the dust-choked air, his footsteps echoing against stone shelves, carved with runes no living elf could fully decipher. He had come seeking guidance, some fragment of wisdom to light his path, but what he found instead was a prophecy, its edges brittle with time. The ink seemed to pulse as he unrolled it, the letters shifting like living things beneath his gaze. When the last king stands at the brink of ruin, it read, "Only the humbling of his pride shall spare the realm." A chill coiled around his spine. For a moment, the weight of those words pressed against him, an invisible hand testing the strength of his resolve. Then, with a scoff, he let the scroll snap shut. Prophecies were the crutches of lesser kings, the desperate mutterings of those who feared to carve their own destiny. Had not his ancestors defied fate itself when they built these halls from the bones of the forest? He would not be shackled by the fears of long-dead seers. Yet as he turned to leave, something strange happened. A draught, sudden and cold, snuffed out every candle in the chamber. Darkness swallowed him whole, and in that blackness, a voice, thin as spider silk, threaded through his mind. "You will kneel, or you will fall." The words clung to him like thorns as he strode from the archives, his cloak swirling with barely contained fury. Outside, the sentries stiffened at his approach, but none dared meet his eyes. Even the trees seemed to lean away as he passed, their leaves trembling, though no wind stirred. The prophecy was nonsense, he told himself, a trick of the light, a jest of the ages. But why, then, did his fingers tighten around the hilt of his dagger at the memory of that voice? Why did the word, humbling, scrape against his thoughts like a blade across stone? By dawn, he was gone, the prophecy left behind like a discarded cloak. Yet in the quiet that followed his departure, the scroll unfurled itself once more upon the archive floor, its words glowing faintly, a warning ignored, a choice unmade. Far beyond the borders of the Woodland Realm, storms began to gather on the horizon, their thunder a low, rolling laughter. The road to the undying lands was long, and fate, unlike kings, was patient. It would wait for him. Thranduil's elk moved with silent grace through the thickening shadows of Mirkwood, where the once familiar paths now coiled like serpents beneath his feet. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and something older, something that slithered just beyond sight. Above him, the canopy choked out the moonlight, leaving only faint phosphorescent fungi to paint the trees in ghostly blues and greens. Every rustle of leaves carried voices that weren't voices, words half-formed and taunting. Turn back, the woods seemed to whisper, even kings kneel here. His grip tightened on the reins, but he did not slow. Then came the skittering, a sound like dry parchment dragged across stone, multiplying, closing in from all sides. The spiders descended in a tide of chitin and venom, their many eyes gleaming with hollow hunger. Thranduil's blade flashed, its edge singing as it carved through the darkness. He fought not as a king atop a throne, but as something wilder, something that remembered the old ways, when elves lived by tooth and claw. One spider lunged, its fangs dripping, and he pivoted, driving his dagger deep into its belly. The creature shrieked, a sound that shook the trees, but its brethren did not flee. They circled, testing, learning. It was then he realized they weren't just hunting. They were herding him, deeper into the grove where the roots knotted into grotesque arches, where the air tasted of spoiled honey. His breath came sharp in his chest, not from exertion, but from the dawning truth. This was no mere ambush. The forest itself was shifting, bending to some will that thrived on despair. As the last spider fell, its legs curling inward like dead leaves, Thranduil wiped his blade clean, but the stain on his spirit remained. The darkness here was not just in the shadows. It was in the way his own doubts slithered forward, whispering that he, too, could unravel. Ahead, the path split. To the left, a narrow trail choked with thorns. To the right, a clearing where pale flowers bloomed, their petals trembling as if in warning. Neither choice felt like safety. Neither felt like chance. Somewhere beyond these woods, the sea called to him, but first, he would have to face the thing that had been growing inside him all along. The thing no blade could pierce. The spiders were just the beginning. The trees grew taller here, their trunks gnarled with age, their roots twisting into shapes that looked almost deliberate, like the fingers of ancient giants, clutching the earth. Thranduil's elk hesitated, its nostrils flaring at a scent older than memory itself. Then came the voice, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground like the first note of a forgotten song. You tread heavily for one who claims to love these woods. The words weren't spoken so much as unfolded, peeling back layers of silence until Thranduil stood frozen, his breath a thin mist in the air. From the shadows stepped Treebeard, eldest of the Ents, his bark-ridged face carved with the patience of centuries. Around him, the forest stirred, not with fear, but with a quiet, knowing tension. The Elven King, the Ent rumbled, comes to us not as a guest, but as a storm. Thranduil's spine stiffened, his pride flaring like a struck match. I seek passage, he said, the edge in his voice sharp enough to cut. The fate of my people hangs in the balance. Treebeard's eyes, deep as mountain pools, studied him. Fate is a river, he replied, but you, Thranduil Oakenshield, have always tried to dam it. The Ents moved closer, their footsteps shaking the earth in slow, deliberate waves. They spoke not with words, but with the creak of branches, the sigh of leaves, a language Thranduil had once known, but long since buried beneath crowns and conquests. Prove you remember, Treebeard challenged, not with steel or spells, but with listening. For the first time in centuries, the Elven King hesitated. The weight of his crown felt suddenly absurd here, where time was measured in rings, not reigns. He knelt, pressing his palm to the moss-streaked ground. The forest hummed beneath his touch, a pulse both foreign and familiar. Hours slipped by like water. Thranduil learned silence, learned the way the wind carried secrets from root to crown, the way the earth held memories of every footfall. When at last he rose, his cloak stained with soil, something had shifted, not in the woods, but in him. Treebeard's laughter rumbled like distant thunder. So, he said, kings can bend. The path ahead shimmered into view, a ribbon of moonlight where before there had been only thorns. As the Ents faded back into the trees, their whispers lingered. You sought strength in stone and blade. But the forest's heart beats softer. Remember that when the darkness comes. Thranduil exhaled, the weight in his chest lighter, yet fuller. The road to the sea still lay ahead, but now he walked it with footsteps that no longer sought to conquer the earth, only to meet it. The ground softened beneath Thranduil's boots as the last murmurs of the Ents faded behind him, replaced by the hush of a forgotten place. The shrine emerged from the mist like a bone jutting from flesh. Its pillars cracked, its once golden runes now blackened with age. Moss clung to the altar, and the scent of damp stone carried whispers of 1,000 unanswered prayers. But it was the silence that struck him most, not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that listens. His fingers twitched at his sides, half expecting the shrine to recoil from his touch. After all, what right had he to stand here, a king who'd turned his back on grace? Kneeling, he pressed his palms to the cold stone. The moment his skin met the altar, the world tore open, not in fire or fury, but in a flood of memory visions surging through him like poison. He saw his sons face the day. He dismissed his warnings about the growing darkness, saw the hollow eyes of his people as he'd barred their gates against refugees fleeing the shadow. Worst of all, he saw himself in the palace mirror, crowned and splendid, while the forest outside wept with rot. Every choice, every prideful snap of his tongue, unraveled before him in grotesque clarity. The shrine offered no judgment, only the truth, laid bare as a wound. A gust of wind howled through the ruins, carrying voices not the Ents' patient wisdom, but the raw, aching cries of those he'd failed. You called it strength, hissed a woman's voice, ragged with grief, turning us away to keep your halls pristine. A child's whimper followed. The spiders came for us first. You could have helped. Thranduil's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his nails scraping against the altar. The pain wasn't in the accusations, but in their simplicity. No grand betrayal, no impossible dilemma, just a king who'd mistaken isolation for power. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision stilled. The shrine's magic coiled around him, not in forgiveness, but in waiting. It demanded no oath, no grand gesture, only that he carry this weight forward. When he opened his eyes, the ruins were unchanged, but the air tasted different. Lighter, somehow, as if the shrine had breathed out after centuries of holding its breath. Thranduil rose, his knees trembling, and for the first time in his long reign, he understood the cost of a crown, not measured in gold, but in the scars left by choices unmade. A single firefly sparked to life above the altar, its glow weak but insistent. It darted toward the trees, pausing as if to say, "Follow." The path ahead was darker now, not with the gloom of Mirkwood, but with the shadow of what he'd finally begun to see. The sea still called, but the king who would reach it was no longer the one who'd left his halls behind. The gates of the Woodland Realm loomed before Thranduil, their once gleaming silver now dulled by neglect and the creeping shadows of distrust. The sentries did not bow as he passed. Their eyes flickered away, their hands tightening around their spears. The air smelled of damp stone and something sharper, fear, simmering beneath the surface like a poison waiting to seep in. Whispers slithered through the corridors, weaving tales of a king who had fled his own throne, leaving his people to wither like leaves in winter. Lord Phalan stood at the heart of it all, his voice smooth as polished oak, his words laced with just enough truth to sting. He left us to chase ghosts across the sea. He murmured to the gathered elves in the council chamber, his fingers tracing the rim of a goblet. While our children tremble at the sound of spiders in the walls, our king seeks salvation in the whispers of gods who have long since turned their backs on us. The murmurs of agreement were quiet but thick, like smoke from a dying fire. Thranduil paused at the threshold of the hall, his cloak still dusted with the soil of his journey. The weight of the shrine's visions pressed against his ribs, the faces of those he'd failed, the voices he'd silenced. Phalan's gaze met his challenging, almost amused. Here was the moment. The old Thranduil would have drawn his blade, let the steel speak where words could not, but the forest had humbled him. The shrine had hollowed him out. And so, for the first time in centuries, he stepped forward without the armor of pride. "What would you have me do?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like an unspoken truce. The room stilled. Phalan's smirk faltered. The king's voice, usually sharp with command, was stripped bare, not of authority, but of pretense. It was not the plea of a weakened ruler, but the offer of a leader finally ready to listen. The silence stretched brittle. Then, from the back of the hall, an elder named Lyrith spoke, her voice cracked with age but clear as spring water. "We do not want a king who rules from a throne of ice," she said. "We want one who remembers the roots of this realm, who fights for the living, not the legends." Thranduil exhaled slowly, the truth settling into his bones. The choice was not between strength and surrender, but between the hollow crown he'd worn for ages and the harder path of true kinship. He turned to Phalan, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. "Call your council," he said. "Let them speak. And when the last voice has fallen silent, I will answer not as a king, but as one who has learned the cost of silence." The room erupted, some in protest, some in cautious hope. But as Thranduil stood there, the weight of his people's gazes upon him, he understood. The true test of his reign was not the battles he'd won, but the trust he'd yet to earn. And trust, unlike obedience, could not be demanded, only earned. The council chamber was a relic of better days' high ceilings, carved with scenes of elven triumph, now dulled by years of disuse. Thranduil stood at the head of the long table, his fingers resting lightly on its scarred surface, the weight of every splinter, a reminder of fractures running deeper than wood. The lords filed in, their robes whispering against the stone floor, their faces unreadable masks. House Anner, House Callan, House Vanya. Each bore sigils of ancient lineage. Each carried grudges older than the trees outside. Phalan entered last, his smile smooth as blade's edge, taking his seat not at the king's right hand, but directly across, a challenge draped in courtesy. Lord Irian of Anner spoke first, his voice brittle with barely contained accusation. "You vanished for weeks without word, while our borders crumbled. And now you summon us as if we're children to be gathered for a scolding." Murmurs rippled through the room, a current of old wounds splitting open. Thranduil inhaled slowly, the shrine's visions still fresh behind his eyes, the faces of those he'd failed, the voices he'd ignored. The old Thranduil would have silenced Irian with a glance, would have reminded them all who wore the crown, but the forest had taught him a harder lesson. Domination might command obedience, but it never earned loyalty. Phalan leaned forward, his goblet untouched. "Tell us, my king," he said, the title dripping like honey laced with venom. "What wisdom did you find in the wilds that we, in our steadfastness here, lacked?" The trap was elegant. If Thranduil spoke of humility, they'd see weakness. If he brandished authority, they'd see arrogance. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then, from the shadows near the doorway, a figure stepped forward, Lady Selwyn of House Callan. Her once vibrant robes faded, her hands etched with scars from tending the sick. "I care little for your word games, Phalan," she said, her voice roughened by smoke and sorrow. "While you polished your rhetoric, I buried 3 children last moon. The spiders take them because we've forgotten how to fight together." Her words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Thranduil felt something shift, not in the room, but in himself. Here was the truth, stripped bare. His people weren't resisting his rule out of spite. They were drowning, and his absence had been one more weight, dragging them under. He straightened, not with the icy majesty of a monarch, but with the weary resolve of a warrior ready to lay down his sword. "Then let us remember," he said, and for the first time in centuries, his voice carried no command, only an invitation. Not as lords and king, but as elves who once knew what it meant to stand as one. Phalan's smirk wavered. The old strategies wouldn't work here, not when the king refused to play his part. But as the lords began to speak haltingly at first, then with growing fervor, of patrols neglected and borders unguarded, of shared losses and shared fears, the air in the chamber changed. The grievances weren't erased, but they were heard, and for the first time in too long, Thranduil listened. The road ahead would be fraught. Trust, once broken, wasn't mended in a single night. But as the candles burned low and the maps unfurled across the table, marked not with divisions, but with shared defenses, something like hope flickered in the dark. Not the grand, blinding hope of prophecies or legends, but the quiet, stubborn kind, the kind that took root in cracked earth and grew anyway. The horns shattered the dawn, their blast sharp as splintered bone. Thranduil was already striding through the chaos, his armor layered over him like second skin, the weight of it nothing compared to the dread pooling in his gut. Orcs, hundreds of them, spilled from the tree line, blackening the earth like rot. His warriors moved with lethal grace, their arrows finding throats and eyes, but the tide kept coming. This wasn't just a raid, it was a reckoning. He fought not from the rear, as kings of legend were wont to do, but at the front, his twin blades carving arcs of silver through the gloom. Every swing carried the weight of his people's fear, every parry a silent vow, not one step further. The strategy unfolded in his mind as instinctively as breath, flanking the orcs against the riverbank, using the terrain to funnel their numbers into killing zones. His captains caught his signals without hesitation, their trust in him, a blade honed by centuries. Yet even as their lines held, the stench of burning flesh curled into the air. The cost was written in the dirt. When the last orc fell, its snarl fading to a gurgle, Thranduil turned and froze. The wounded lay in rows, their blood seeping into the roots of the forest. Among them, faces too young for battle stared up at the smoke-choked sky. A boy, barely past his first century, clutched a shattered arm, his lips pressed tight against the pain. Another, her braids still threaded with spring blossoms, gasped as healers pressed hands to her side, These weren't just soldiers. They were children who'd grown up hearing tales of his grandeur, who'd followed him into hell because they still believed in the myth of the unbroken king. The victory soured in his mouth. He knelt beside the boy, pressing a hand to his forehead. "You fought well," he murmured. The lie tasted bitter. No one fought well in their first slaughter. The boy's eyes, wide with shock and dawning horror, mirrored his own the day he'd lost his father to this same endless war. How many generations would bleed for the mistakes of the past? How many more children would learn to hate the sunrise because it meant another day of counting the dead? A hand gripped his shoulder. Captain Galleon, his face streaked with soot and something darker. "We pushed them back," he said, voice hoarse. "But they'll return. They always do." Thranduil rose, his muscles screaming, his crown suddenly heavier than the corpse-strewn field. Leadership, he realized, wasn't measured in battles won, but in the lives he couldn't spare. The forest whispered around him, its leaves trembling not with wind, but with the echoes of all the promises he'd made, and all the ones he'd failed to keep. That night, in the torchlit gloom of the healing halls, he walked among the wounded, his cloak brushing against cots, where elves flinched even in sleep. Here, the reality of kingship wasn't in the glint of a crown or the sweep of a throne. It was in the way a mother's hand tightened around her son's fingers when the king passed by, as if his very shadow might steal what little piece they'd clawed back from the darkness. He stepped into the cold air outside, the stars blotted out by smoke. Somewhere beyond the borders, the enemy licked their wounds and plotted, but the true battle wasn't out there. It was in the silence of the halls behind him, in the eyes of those who'd trusted him to keep the night at bay, and in the crushing truth that no blade, no strategy, could ever be sharp enough to cut them free from the weight of his choices. The path to the grove was a secret even to most elves, a thread of moonlight woven between the trees, visible only to those who knew how to see with something deeper than sight. Thranduil moved through the underbrush with the quiet reverence of a pilgrim, his boots barely disturbing the moss beneath him. Here, the air hummed with a quiet magic, the kind that didn't roar like fire or flash like lightning, but whispered, steady and sure, like a heartbeat beneath the world. Branches parted before him, revealing a clearing bathed in silver, not the pale, borrowed glow of the moon, but the true light of stars, unchanged, unfiltered, as if a piece of the ancient sky had fallen to earth and taken root. She was waiting for him. Lothian stood beside a pool of liquid starlight, her hands cradling a cluster of withered flowers. At first glance, she seemed young, her face unlined by time, but her eyes held the weight of centuries. "You've come to mend the land," she said, not as a question, but as a fact laid bare between them. Thranduil's jaw tightened. "I've come for knowledge." "For power." Her laughter was soft, like water over stone. "Power," she echoed, "is what brought you here broken. Try again." For the first time in his long reign, words failed him. The grove seemed to press in, the very air urging honesty. "I don't know how to fix what I've broken," he admitted, the confession ripped from someplace deep and raw. Lothian's fingers brushed the petals in her hands, and as she exhaled, the flowers shuddered, their crumpled edges unfurling, their stems straightening with new life. "Compassion isn't a spell," Thranduil Oakenshield, she murmured. "It's a choice, to see the wound, to touch it, to stay." She led him to the pool, its surface rippling with constellations no mortal had ever named. "Look," she commanded, not at the stars above, but at his own reflection, not the king in armor, but the elf beneath, his pride stripped away like bark from a storm-struck tree. The face that stared back was lined with grief, with exhaustion, with the terrible, aching weight of trying to hold an entire world on his shoulders alone. "You cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge," Lúthien said, her voice gentle but unyielding. Days blurred into nights. Thranduil learned to kneel in the dirt, his palms pressed to the roots of dying trees, pouring not just magic into them, but attention. The simple, painful act of witnessing their struggle. He tended to blighted saplings and wounded animals, his hands growing steady with patience rather than force, and slowly, something in him began to unravel. Not like a tapestry cut loose, but like a knot meeting gentle fingers at last. One evening, as fireflies traced lazy circles above them, Lúthien handed him a seed small, dark, impossibly fragile. "For your gardens," she said. He frowned. "This will take decades to grow." Her smile was knowing. "Yes, and you will never sit beneath its shade, but someone will." The truth of it struck him like a physical blow. Leadership wasn't about legacy, about carving his name into stone. It was about planting trees whose branches he'd never feel, for elves he'd never meet. When he left the grove at last, the starlight clung to his cloak like a promise. The road ahead was still shadowed, the battles far from over, but the king who returned to his halls carried something new in his chest. Not the brittle certainty of old, but the quiet, terrifying courage of a man who had finally learned how to kneel. The rumors began as whispers, thin, poison-tipped things slipped into conversations between guards at shift change, murmured over wine cups in the nobles' quarters. They said Thranduil had met with Orc chieftains under cover of darkness, that the recent attacks had been too precise, too convenient for a king who'd once barred his gates against refugees. Phalan's handiwork was elegant, a discarded cloak stained with Orc blood, found near the eastern border, a forged letter in Thranduil's own script, speaking of cleansing the weak from the realm. Lies, all of it, but lies wrapped in just enough truth to fester. The council's vote was swift. Even those who'd begun to trust again now recoiled, their faces twisting with betrayal as Phalan presented his evidence with theatrical sorrow. "I take no joy in this," he lied, pressing a hand to his heart as the verdict was cast. "But a king who betrays his own cannot remain." Thranduil stood motionless as they stripped him of his crown, his armor, even the dagger he'd carried since his youth. The cold bite of the wind through his tunic was nothing compared to the ice in his veins as he was led to the gates, not as a ruler, but as an outcast. The forest welcomed him differently now. Where once the trees had bowed to his presence, now their branches seemed to clutch at him like accusers. He slept in hollows scoured by rain, ate berries bitter with unripe resentment. Hunger gnawed at him, but worse was the gnawing of doubt. Had his pride truly blinded him so completely? Had he sown this ruin himself? Then, on the third night, the wolves came. Not the sleek hunters of the north, but gaunt, yellow-eyed creatures that slunk from the shadows with ribs protruding like broken ladders. Their growls carried the same hunger he felt, not just for meat, but for survival at any cost. Thranduil raised his hands, empty of weapons but trembling with something older than steel. The Alpha lunged, and he sang, not a spell, not a command, but the first thing that rose from his gut, a lullaby his mother had crooned to him centuries ago, when the world was simpler. The notes were ragged, off-key, but the wolves paused, their ears twitching. The alpha sniffed the air, then turned away with a huff, its pack melting back into the trees. Thranduil's knees buckled. For the first time, he understood. Power wasn't in dominance. It was in the willingness to be vulnerable, to offer trust before demanding it. Dawn found him at the edge of a human village, its thatched roofs smoking lazily in the morning light. A child spotted him first, her eyes widening at his ragged elven garb. Instead of fleeing, she held out a crust of bread, her fingers grubby but steady. "You look sad," she announced. The simplicity of it shattered him. He accepted the bread with hands that had once wielded kingdoms, now learning, at last, to receive. News traveled faster than he did. By the time he reached the Old Hermit's cave at the foot of the mountains, even the crows seemed to caw of Phalan's rising tyranny. The closed borders, the forced labor, the disappearances of those who spoke against him. The hermit, a gnarled old elf who'd turned his back on courts long ago, smirked as Thranduil approached. "Exile suits you," he rasped. "Less gold, more you." Phalan had made one fatal error, though. In his haste to vilify Thranduil, he'd forgotten the oldest law of elvenkind. A crown taken by deceit never sits easy. Already, murmurs stirred in the deep places of the realm. A healer here, a sentry there. Those who remembered the touch of a king who'd finally learned to kneel. Thranduil cupped his hands in the hermit's fire, letting the heat sear away the last illusions. The road back would be longer than the road out, but for the first time in centuries, he carried no sword, only the quiet certainty of a man who'd finally found his true armor. Not in gold or vengeance, but in the unshakable weight of having nothing left to prove. The forest was no longer just a kingdom's border. It was a lifeline, a teacher, a brutal but honest companion. Thranduil moved like mist through the undergrowth, his steps silent as owl feathers brushing the earth. Hunger had honed him, stripping away the last remnants of royal pretense, until only instinct remained. He drank from streams clouded with pollen, ate mushrooms that glowed faintly in the dark, their bitter tang a reminder that survival was never sweet. The trees whispered warnings when orc patrols neared. The wind carried the scent of rain before the first drop fell. This was a language he'd once known, buried beneath centuries of ruling from stone halls. Now it flowed back into his bones like a half-remembered song. The fox found him at twilight, her forepaw mangled caught in some trapper's snare, perhaps, or torn by teeth. She should have fled at the scent of him. Instead, she limped closer, her golden eyes holding neither fear nor submission, only a weary calculation. Thranduil knelt, offering a palm smeared with crushed yarrow leaves. The fox sniffed, hesitated, then allowed his touch. Her trust was a blade to his ribs. How many creatures had he dismissed as beneath his notice? How many alliances had he spurned for being imperfect, inconvenient? Night after night, he shared his meager catches: field mice, fat grubs, the occasional stolen egg, tearing the meat into scraps she could manage. In return, she taught him the forest's hidden grammar, which hollows echoed with approaching footsteps, which berries left no trace in scat. Once, she woke him with a frantic nudge, her ears flattened, just before a spider's leg speared through the moss where his head had lain. Solitude carved him hollow, and the prophecy filled the spaces. Only the humbling of his pride shall spare the realm. The words coiled in his chest, sharper with each dawn. Humbling wasn't a single act. he realized not just kneeling in a shrine or listening to a council. It was the daily surrender of certainty, the admission that a wounded fox knew the woods better than a king. One morning, he woke to find her gone, the ground where she'd slept pressed into a perfect oval. No tracks led away. Perhaps she'd finally healed enough to run. Perhaps she'd been a dream, but the lesson remained. Loyalty wasn't commanded. It was earned in silence, in shared hunger, in the unspoken pact between two creatures who'd chosen to stop pretending they needed no one. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid stench of smoke. Not campfires too thick, too greedy. His head snapped up. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the forest was burning. And Thranduil, exile though he was, still knew the shape of those flames. They moved with purpose, with strategy. Phalan's work. The fox had been his teacher. The fire would be his test. The shrine loomed before him once more, its cracked stones darker now, as if the weight of his failures had seeped into the rock itself. Thranduil's breath fogged the air, his fingers numb from the journey, but the cold was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest. He didn't kneel this time, he collapsed, his forehead pressed to the altar's edge, the scent of moss and old blood filling his nostrils. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered, the words raw, stripped of kingship, of pride, of everything but the desperation beneath. The answer came not in words, but in a rush of blinding white. The world dissolved around him, and suddenly, he was standing in a throne room, but not his own. Sunlight streamed through open windows, gilding the laughter of children as they darted between pillars woven with living ivy. Elves gathered in clusters, not in hushed deference, but in easy camaraderie, their hands busy with tools, with instruments, with the quiet work of healing. And at the center stood a figure in silver robes, his face lined with years, but his eyes alight himself, older, weary, but unburdened. The vision shifted. The forest beyond the gates was lush, vibrant, its branches heavy with fruit instead of spiders. Refugees from distant lands knelt in the soil beside his people, planting saplings that would outlast them all. There were no walls, no barred gates, only a kingdom that breathed, that grew, because its king had learned to let go. Then the crushing truth: this future wasn't won by blade or decree. It was built on the ruins of his pride, the Valor's message seared into his bones. You must lose to win, you must break to mend. The vision snapped like a thread. Thranduil gasped, his hands scrabbling at the shrine's edge as the world rushed back. But something had changed. The air tasted sharper, the silence hummed. For the first time in centuries, he saw the path ahead with terrifying clarity. He rose, his legs unsteady, but his purpose iron. The crown he'd once clung to, as proof of his worth, meant nothing. The throne was just a chair. The kingdom, the people were what mattered, and if reclaiming them meant walking back into the heart of his failures with empty hands and a heart laid bare, then so be it. The forest seemed to lean closer as he passed, the trees whispering not in warning, but in recognition. The king who had left these woods months ago was gone. In his place walked something simpler, something truer, a man ready to kneel before his own people and rise as their servant. Somewhere beyond the trees, Phalan's fires still burned. But Thranduil no longer carried the need to meet them with flame. Let the usurper clutch his stolen crown. The real battle wasn't for a throne. It was for the right to stand before his people and say, without flinching, I was wrong. But I am here now. The hidden passages beneath the Woodland Realm had been built for escape, not infiltration, narrow, damp, and laced with the scent of centuries-old stone. Thranduil moved through them now not as a king, but as a shadow, his palms brushing the walls to guide him in the pitch-black dark. Above him, the palace thrummed with Phalan's hollow revelry, the clatter of goblets, the forced laughter of lords who traded loyalty for survival. But in the kitchens, the stables, the barracks, whispers slithered like underground springs. A stable hand who'd seen Phalan's men deliver sacks of gold to Orc chieftains. A weaver who'd overheard plans to sell elven children to slavers from the east. These were the allies Thranduil sought, not warriors, but witnesses. Their voices would be his blade. Dawn was a blade's edge away when he stepped into the throne room, unannounced, unarmed. The gasps of the assembled court were sharper than any arrow. Phalan, perched on the carved oak, thrown like a crow on a branch, stiffened, but his smirk didn't waver. The traitor returns, he drawled, flicking a hand toward the guards. None moved. Thranduil didn't raise his voice. "You accused me of bargaining with orcs," he said, calm as a frozen lake. "Yet it was your own seal on the missives sent to their warlords. Your own signature on the orders to burn villages that refused your tithes." Phalan's fingers twitched toward the dagger at his belt. "Lies," he hissed. But the room was shifting, the weight of too many unspoken suspicions pressing down. Then came the rasp of a door opening. Lyrith, the elder whose daughter had vanished under Phalan's reign, stepped forward, her gnarled hands clutching a scroll. "My liege," she said, addressing Thranduil as if the usurper weren't there at all. "We found these in his chambers." The parchment unfurled shipments of weapons, dates of planned attacks, all in Phalan's meticulous hand. The unraveling was swift, merciless. A guardsman spat at Phalan's feet. A noblewoman tore the brooch of office from her cloak. Thranduil didn't gloat, didn't strike. He simply stood, silent, his face a mirror for every betrayal, every broken promise. And in that silence, Phalan saw the truth. Power seized by deceit could only ever be a hollow thing. When he fled, it wasn't with a roar, but a whimper, his fine robes snagging on the brambles as he vanished into the forest that had once bowed to him. The throne room was utterly still. Thranduil didn't approach the dais, didn't reach for the crown his people now pressed into his hands. Instead, he knelt not to them, but with them, his forehead pressed to the cold floor. "I failed you," he said, the words raw, unvarnished. "But if you'll have me, I will spend every breath I have left trying to mend what I broke." The silence stretched, aching. Then, one by one, the elves knelt beside him, not in submission, in solidarity. The crown lay forgotten between them, no longer a symbol of rule, but a relic of the past. Outside, the first birds of morning began to sing, their notes weaving through the trees like a promise. From shattered things, new growth could rise. The first seedlings took root in the scarred earth, where Thranduil himself knelt, his cloak stained with soil, his palms raw from turning the poisoned ground. These were no ordinary saplings. Their seeds had been blessed by Luthian's starlight, their slender trunks pulsing with a faint silver glow as they drank in the sunlight. Word spread faster than the roots could grow. Elves who had once trembled behind locked gates now gathered at dawn with baskets of acorns and cuttings from the oldest healthy trees, their laughter threading through the groves like birdsong, returning after winter. Even the children came, their small hands patting the earth tenderly around each new planting, as if tucking in a friend for the night. The borders, once bristling with spears and suspicion, now saw caravans from Dale laden with sacks of rich river soil, a gift from King Bard's people. At first, the dwarves came only to trade their axes exchanged for healing herbs, their gruff nods hiding grudging respect. But when a band of orcs, desperate and starving, attacked a dwarven mining caravan near the forest's edge, it was Thranduil's archers who turned the tide without hesitation. The dwarven elder who arrived at the palace afterward carried no gemstones or mithril as tribute. Instead, he placed a single ironwood sapling on the steps of the throne, its leaves already unfurling in the dappled light. Sturdy stuff, this, he grunted, grows where naught else will. The alliance that day was sealed not with treaties, but with the quiet understanding that some wounds could only heal together. Night by night, the forest exhaled. Flowers bloomed where spiderwebs had once choked the underbrush, their petals shimmering with dewdrops that caught the moonlight like scattered stars. And as the trees grew taller, the elves began to sing again, not the mournful dirges of fading glory, but the old, wild melodies that had once made the very air vibrate with joy. Their voices wove through the branches, coaxing shy creatures from their burrows, stitching the fabric of the woods back together note by note. A traveling minstrel from Rivendell, passing through, wept openly at the sound. "It's been centuries," she whispered, "since Middle-earth heard the Woodland Realm laugh. Yet Thranduil's work was far from done. In the darkest hollows, where the shadow's taint ran deep, even the starlight saplings faltered." Here, the king came alone, pressing his forehead to the gnarled bark of ancient oaks that still trembled with remembered pain. He spoke to them not as subjects, but as kin apologies, promises, fragments of stories from the days when the forest had been young and unafraid. Slowly, stubbornly, life crept back. A single bright mushroom here, a clutch of violets there, as if the earth itself was relearning how to hope. The true test came on Midsummer's Eve, when the elves lit lanterns in the clearing where the worst battles had raged. Thranduil stood barefoot in the grass, his crown left behind in the palace, as children wove garlands around the newly planted trees. A hush fell as the first notes of the evening song rose, a melody so old, even the wind seemed to pause to listen. And for the first time in generations, the trees answered. Their leaves rustled in perfect harmony, their branches swaying as if dancing to a tune only they could remember. The realm wasn't just healing, it was waking up. The festival fires burned low, their embers painting the faces of the gathered elves in soft gold. Laughter rang through the trees, the kind that comes from bellies full of good food and hearts unburdened by fear. Thranduil stood apart, watching his people dance, their feet tracing patterns older than the stars above. The air smelled of ripening fruit and wood smoke, a far cry from the decay that had once clung to these woods. Yet even as he breathed it in, a chill prickled at the base of his spine, not the bite of winter, but the quiet dread of a promise yet unfulfilled. The shadow came without sound. One moment the clearing was bathed in firelight, the next the flames guttered as if snuffed by an unseen hand. The laughter died. Children clung to their parents, their wide eyes reflecting not fear, but recognition. The Wraith wore no face, yet every elf present knew it. not as a monster, but as a memory-given form. Thranduil's breath caught. This was no orc chieftain, no spider queen. This was the sum of every choice he'd made in pride, every life he deemed unworthy, every moment he turned away from the pain of others. It stood before him now, its form shifting like smoke, and the clearing trembled. The old Thranduil would have drawn his blades. The king who once ruled from a throne of ice would have met this specter with steel and fury. But the elf who had knelt in the dirt planting trees he'd never sit beneath, who had let a child's grubby hands feed him bread, who had learned to listen to the whispers of roots and foxes, this Thranduil simply stood. "I see you," he said, his voice steady, not an accusation, not a challenge, an acknowledgment. The wraith lunged, its form dissolving into 1,000 shards of darkness, each one a face from his past. The refugees he turned away at his gates, their eyes hollow with hunger. The soldiers who died following orders he'd given in arrogance. The son who'd begged him to see beyond his own crown. They swarmed him, their voices a chorus of sorrow, their touch like frost on his skin. Thranduil closed his eyes. "I was wrong," he whispered, 3 words. 3 words that shattered something inside him, not like glass, but like ice melting in spring, painful, necessary. When he opened his eyes again, the wraith was still there, but its edges had softened. The faces within it no longer snarled, they wept, and so did he. Tears carved paths through the dirt on his cheeks, falling to the earth where new saplings stretched toward the sky. The wraith's form rippled, its darkness thinning, until all that remained was a single shaft of moonlight where the specter had stood. The firelight returned, brighter than before, and the elves exhaled as one. No one cheered. No ballads would be sung of this battle, for it had been fought not with weapons, but with the terrible, quiet courage of a king who had finally faced himself. Thranduil wiped his face with the back of his hand, his fingers coming away stained with soil and salt. Around him, his people went back to their dancing, their voices lifting in a song older than sorrow. The trees swayed in time, their leaves brushing against one another like hands clasping in the dark. And high above, unnoticed by all but the eldest of the elves, the stars burned a little brighter, as if the heavens themselves were whispering, "At last." At last, the wraith's dissolution left the air tingling, as if the very atoms of the world had realigned. Thranduil's knees struck the earth, not from weakness, but from the weight of absolution, an unshackling so profound it reverberated through the soil. Around him, the forest shuddered, leaves unfurled in midwinter, their edges gilded with light. Roots pulsed like living veins, and the river, long sluggish with despair, broke into song over its stones. The Valor's blessing came not as thunder or flame, but as the gentlest exhale, starlight pooling in the hollows of the king's clasped hands, warm as a child's breath against his skin. His people did not rush forward, they did not cheer. One by one, they knelt not the stiff bows of subjects to a sovereign, but the slow, deliberate bending of saplings toward the sun. A weaver pressed her forehead to the moss. A soldier laid his sword crosswise over his knees. Even the children stilled, their small fingers curled around acorns, as if cradling the future itself. Thranduil rose, and the light clinging to him cast no shadow. It woven itself into his hair, his tattered robes, the lines of his face. Not the cold brilliance of crowns, but the soft, enduring glow of a hearth after long darkness. The change was in the silence. Not the hollow quiet of fear or the tense hush before battle, but the kind of stillness that exists between heartbeats, between the turn of the world from night to dawn. The trees leaned in, their branches knitting together overhead like clasped hands. Somewhere deep in the forest, an ancient oak that had stood barren for centuries split its bark with a sound like laughter, and a single white blossom tumbled into the king's palm. He understood then, the Valor had not granted him strength or victory or even forgiveness. They had offered something far more terrifying, the chance to begin again. Not as a ruler armored in pride, but as a steward with dirt under his nails and the scent of healing herbs clinging to his sleeves. The last of his chains fell away, not with a clatter, but with the sound of roots drinking deep from thawed earth. The wind carried the change beyond the borders of the Woodland Realm. Birds took flight with twigs clenched in their beaks, bound for blighted lands. Rivers altered their courses to kiss long parched shores, and in the halls of distant kingdoms, those who had once spat Thranduil's name like a curse paused, fingers hovering over maps, sensing the shift in the pattern of the world. His people rose when he moved among them, their hands brushing his shoulders, their tears salting the earth where new growth would rise. No speeches were given. No oaths were sworn. The pact was written in the way the elven children wove flowers into his hair without hesitation, in how the oldest warrior among them sheathed his blade and reached instead for a seed pouch. The realm needed no grand proclamations. The proof was in the soil, in the light, in the quiet, understanding that the true guardians of Middle-earth were not those who sought to conquer its shadows, but those who knelt to tend its wounds. And when the first snows came, they did not smother the land. They cradled it, each flake a whispered promise. The long winter was over. Years had woven themselves into the forest, like new rings in ancient bark. Thranduil stood at the edge of the glade, his fingers brushing the trunk of a malorn tree, one he'd planted as a sapling the spring after his return. Now its golden leaves shimmered in the twilight, casting dappled light over the children who danced beneath it, their bare feet kicking up petals from blossoms that had not bloomed in centuries. Their laughter was a sound he'd once feared forgotten, bright, unburdened, alive. A little girl with grass-stained knees tumbled into his legs, her cheeks flushed, her hands clutching a wreath of bluebells. "For you," she panted, thrusting it upward. The flowers trembled, their stems still damp with sap. He crouched to accept it, and as she scampered back to her friends, he recognized her, Lyarth's great-granddaughter, her eyes the same fierce green as the elder who'd once called him out before the council. The crown he wore now was lighter than the first, not gold or mithril, but living willow, its branches braided by the hands of the very elves who'd once doubted him. It grew with the realm, its leaves whispering secrets only the trees could hear. Some nights, when the wind carried the scent of distant snow, he'd catch himself reaching for the phantom weight of his old diadem, only to smile at the absence. Power had never been in the metal, but in the roots beneath his feet, in the trust of the child who'd gifted him flowers without bowing. A rustle in the underbrush drew his gaze. His son, their son, returned from years beyond the mountains, stood watching the dancers, his face softened by something deeper than pride. When their eyes met, Legolas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The nod they shared carried more than words ever could, an understanding, a forgiveness, a future unshackled from the past. Thranduil's throat tightened. Once, he'd thought legacy meant statues and sagas. Now he knew it lived in the way the young ones mimicked the old songs without being taught, in the way the trees bore fruit where spiders had once spun their webs. The first stars blinked awake overhead, their light filtering through the leaves like a blessing. His time was waning. He felt it in the slow, sweet ache of his bones, in the way the forest murmured his name, less like a title and more like a lullaby. But as the children's voices rose in a chorus older than kingdoms, as the Malorn shed a single golden leaf onto his shoulder, he knew this with absolute certainty. Endings were just another kind of seed. And the world he'd helped mend would outgrow him, as surely as spring outgrew the winter. He closed his eyes, letting the laughter and the rustling leaves weave together into a melody he'd carry with him, even when the path turned westward at last. Not a king's requiem, but a woodsman's lullaby, simple, enduring, and unafraid.